In a city where the elite swirled in a dance of champagne flutes and whispered deals, Harris Desmond found himself increasingly detached from the sparkle. Born into a world of privilege, he'd long enjoyed the benefits of his family's wealth, but over time, the glitter dulled. The women around him, their interest always piqued by the weight of his last name rather than the weight of his words, began to blend together. Each date was just another reminder that to them, he wasn't a person, but a prize, a wallet wrapped in silk. Harris wanted something more, something real. He didn't want to be the man they wanted to marry because his future bank account looked better than theirs. It wasn't enough to be loved for the lifestyle he could provide. He longed for affection that couldn't be bought, for someone who saw the man beneath the inheritance. It was in this moment of quiet frustration that he had a radical idea. What if he shed his skin of privilege entirely? What if he let himself be judged not for his wealth, but for his character? The world that had always catered to him suddenly felt like a prison of expectations, and Harris was determined to break free. If no one could love him without the knowledge of his wealth, then maybe he didn't need that kind of love at all. He decided to disappear, not physically, but in every way that counted. Taking only the bare essentials, Harris crafted a new identity. Gone were the tailored suits and luxury cars. In their place, the simple clothes of a man who worked with his hands. He would hide his millions behind dirt-streaked jeans and a job no one would expect from someone of his standing. A gardener, anonymous, unnoticed, and far from the circles of wealth he had known. His search led him to a grand mansion owned by a woman named Rebecca, whose reputation preceded her. Rumors of her obsession with money, control, and status were common, but it wasn't her Harris was interested in. He'd heard whispers of a stepdaughter named Clara, a quiet girl who lived in the shadow of her mother's ambitions and her stepsister's entitlement. She, too, was an outsider in the gilded cage, and that intrigued Harris. Stepping into the mansion's grounds for the first time, Harris felt the weight of his disguise. No one here knew who he really was. To them, he was just another laborer, invisible, unimportant, disposable. But it was exactly what he wanted. The sprawling estate reflected Rebecca's obsession with power, and the staff moved carefully, as if each misstep might cost them more than their jobs. Harris knew he would have to play his role well, blending into the background while quietly observing. It didn't take long for him to see how things worked inside the mansion. Rebecca was every bit as controlling as he'd been warned. Her eyes rarely left her daughter, Mercy, whose future Rebecca meticulously crafted, always with the goal of securing a substantial inheritance. The thought of Mercy inheriting the entire fortune wasn't just a dream, it was Rebecca's singular focus. And then there was Clara. From the moment Harris first saw her, it was clear she was different. Where Mercy's every move screamed privilege, Clara's posture reflected the weight of someone who had learned to expect little from the world. Though she was Rebecca's stepdaughter, it was obvious she didn't enjoy the same luxuries. Clara worked quietly in the background, always polite, always kind, yet always overlooked. It was clear to Harris that she'd spent a lifetime being pushed aside. Clara's resilience was what struck him most. Despite the coldness directed at her by both Rebecca and Mercy, she remained steadfast in her gentleness. Harris noticed how she would offer a smile to the staff, how she always thanked them for their work. It wasn't much, but it spoke volumes. It was as if she understood that kindness could be the last refuge in a world determined to strip it away. Harris decided to observe from a distance, resisting the urge to intervene. He had to know whether Clara's character was as pure as it seemed. Slowly, he integrated himself into the household, making sure to stay in the background, unnoticed by Rebecca and Mercy. Each day, he watched as Clara moved through the house, sometimes enduring her stepmother's sharp remarks, sometimes comforting herself with small moments of solitude in the garden. He admired her strength and her refusal to become bitter despite the circumstances. One afternoon, while trimming the hedges near Clara's favorite spot in the garden, Harris overheard her softly singing to herself. It was a melancholy tune, but there was a sweetness to it. He couldn't help but wonder how much pain she'd hidden behind that quiet smile. And yet there she was, surviving in a house that clearly didn't love her. In moments like this, Harris saw flashes of what he had longed for, someone who valued more than what the world could offer in material goods. Clara's quiet dignity, her ability to endure without complaint, spoke louder than any grand gesture. She hadn't been given wealth, but she was richer in ways that Rebecca and Mercy would never understand. As days passed, Harris found himself drawn more and more to Clara. Not just because of her beauty, though that was undeniable, but because of her heart. She was everything he had hoped to find, someone who didn't care about appearances, someone who gave without expecting anything in return. But for now, he kept his distance, unsure of how or when to reveal his true self. He was playing a dangerous game, living a double life in a house where power and control ruled every interaction. But Harris knew one thing for sure: if Clara was as genuine as she seemed, then maybe, just maybe, he had found what he was looking for. As Harris settled into his role as a gardener, he quickly became acquainted with the household's dynamics. It didn't take long to see the contrast between Rebecca's cold authority and Clara's quiet resilience. While Rebecca maintained a sharp eye on everything that happened under her roof, Clara seemed to move as if she were invisible. She floated through rooms like a ghost, always there but never truly seen, a delicate balance of duty and silence. Rebecca, however, was impossible to miss. Her presence dominated every conversation, her words dripping with an entitlement that left no room for empathy. Everything about her revolved around wealth and control, maintaining it, expanding it, and most importantly, ensuring that her daughter Mercy would inherit it all. Rebecca had a fierce obsession with securing Mercy's future. She had carefully groomed her for a life of luxury and dominance, and there was no room for mistakes. Mercy, on the other hand, was the perfect reflection of her mother's upbringing. She flaunted the privileges that came with wealth and carried herself with the arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything. Despite this, she lacked the cunning of her mother. Where Rebecca's actions were calculated and intentional, Mercy acted with the reckless abandon of someone who assumed the world would always bend to her will. Harris watched it all unfold from the shadows, keeping his cover intact. Rebecca had no interest in him beyond making sure the garden was maintained. Mercy barely acknowledged his existence unless it was to bark an order or ask for something trivial. Clara, on the other hand, was different. She treated him as if he were more than just a tool in the household. There was a warmth in her eyes that stood out starkly against the coldness that pervaded the mansion. But even Clara had her limits. Harris could see the weight she carried. It wasn't just the chores or the expectations that burdened her, it was the constant reminder that she didn't belong. Every day, Rebecca made it clear that Clara was an outsider. Though she lived in the mansion, she wasn't really a part of it. Mercy was the golden child, destined for everything, while Clara was a placeholder, filling space until Rebecca could find a way to rid the house of her for good. Rebecca's manipulations were subtle, but effective. She never openly attacked Clara, but her intentions were clear. Every action, every word was designed to diminish Clara's presence. There were small cruelties that seemed insignificant on their own but collectively painted a picture of quiet suffering. Clara's meals were served late, her clothing was never updated, and when visitors came, she was instructed to stay out of sight. Harris noticed it all, the systematic way Rebecca chipped away at Clara's dignity. The only time Clara seemed truly at peace was in the garden, away from the prying eyes of her stepmother and stepsister. Harris would often see her there, tending to flowers with a kind of tenderness that felt almost out of place in such a rigid household. She would hum softly to herself, her fingers brushing over petals as if offering them comfort. It was here that Harris began to understand the depth of her character. Despite everything, Clara held on to her kindness. She greeted the staff with a genuine smile, thanked them for their work, and never let her treatment define her. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of asserting her own value in a world that constantly tried to strip it away. Harris found himself admiring her more with each passing day. It was during one of these quiet moments that Clara first spoke to him beyond the usual pleasantries. She had noticed him trimming the hedges near the rose bushes, and with a small smile, she approached. "You're doing a wonderful job with the garden," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "It's the one place in this house that still feels alive." Harris looked up, surprised by her words. He had grown accustomed to blending into the background, forgotten by everyone but Clara. "Thank you," he replied, unsure of what else to say. Her presence had a calming effect on him, and he found himself wanting to know more about her. But he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't let her know who he really was, not yet. Over time, their conversations became more frequent. Clara seemed to find solace in talking to him, as if he were the only person who wasn't part of the toxic web her family had spun. She never complained, never spoke ill of Rebecca or Mercy, but Harris could hear the unspoken pain in her words. It was clear that she had learned to carry her burden with grace, but it didn't make the weight any less heavy. Mercy, meanwhile, grew more impatient. She had noticed Clara and Harris speaking from time to time, and though she didn't care much for Clara, the attention Harris gave her stepsister didn't sit well with her. Mercy was used to being the center of attention, especially in her mother's eyes, and she didn't like the idea of anyone, even a mere gardener, focusing on someone else. One day, as Harris was working in the garden, Mercy approached him with a flirtatious grin. "You've been spending a lot of time out here," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I hope you're not getting distracted." Harris, sensing the shift in her demeanor, gave a polite smile and nodded. "Just doing my job," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Mercy wasn't satisfied with the response. She was accustomed to getting what she wanted, and right now, she wanted Harris's attention. "You know," she continued, stepping closer, "you could always do something more interesting with your time." Her words were laced with suggestion, but Harris remained unfazed. He had seen this behavior before, in countless women who only cared for status and appearances. What Mercy didn't realize was that Harris had already seen enough to know where her heart truly lay, and it wasn't with him. Her interest was shallow, rooted in the assumption that she was desirable simply because she was wealthy and beautiful. Harris wasn't fooled. As Mercy's frustration grew, so did Rebecca's scheming. Harris could feel the tension in the house rising, and he knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. Clara was too kind to see it, but Rebecca was playing a long game, and Mercy was a willing pawn in her mother's plans. Harris kept his distance, observing quietly, knowing that soon, the balance of power would shift. As the days passed, Harris found himself drawn deeper into the web of Rebecca's household. Clara's kindness stood in stark contrast to the cold calculation that seemed to govern every decision Rebecca made. It was clear now that this wasn't just a family, but a battlefield, and Harris was beginning to see the real stakes at play. While Rebecca was busy ensuring that Mercy's future was secured, she had already begun her campaign to push Clara out entirely. The more Harris observed, the clearer it became. Rebecca viewed Clara not as a daughter, but as an obstacle. Her obsession with protecting Mercy's inheritance had reached a fever pitch, and she was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that Clara had no claim to the family's fortune. There were whispered conversations, hushed plans exchanged with lawyers, and quiet phone calls that Harris overheard while maintaining the garden. It all pointed to the same goal: cutting Clara off completely, ensuring that everything would belong to Mercy. Harris knew he couldn't stand by any longer. He had come here to find genuine love, and it was becoming painfully obvious that Clara was the only person in this house who deserved his loyalty. She had treated him with kindness, not knowing who he really was, while Mercy and Rebecca looked at him as nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. It was during one particularly tense afternoon that Harris made a decision. He couldn't watch Clara be pushed out, manipulated, and discarded like she was nothing. If Rebecca was determined to erase Clara's place in the family, then he would step in to make sure that didn't happen. But he had to be careful. Revealing his identity too soon would tip Rebecca off and give her the upper hand. He needed to be strategic, to wait for the right moment. In the meantime, Harris and Clara's bond continued to grow. Their quiet conversations in the garden had shifted from casual to meaningful, with Clara slowly opening up about the life she had led. It was a life filled with isolation, surrounded by wealth but never truly a part of it. Clara had long since resigned herself to being the forgotten child, the one who wasn't meant to stand out. It pained Harris to hear how easily she accepted her place in the background, how accustomed she had become to being overlooked. But there was a strength in Clara that Harris admired. Despite everything, she never allowed herself to be consumed by bitterness or anger. She remained kind, even when the world around her was anything but. Harris knew that this was what he had been searching for all along, someone whose heart wasn't swayed by riches or power. In Clara, he saw the potential for a love that was real, a connection that had nothing to do with his status or his family's fortune. The moment he decided to propose to her, Harris felt a mixture of excitement and fear. He had to be careful. If Rebecca found out about their growing relationship, she would stop at nothing to keep Clara from finding happiness. And so, Harris planned his proposal in secret, keeping everything under the radar until the moment was right. When the day finally came, Harris approached Clara with his heart in his throat. They were alone in the garden, the one place where they both felt free from the tension of the household. Clara had no idea what was coming. She smiled softly as she tended to the flowers, unaware that Harris was about to change everything. With a quiet determination, Harris got down on one knee and pulled a simple ring from his pocket. "Clara," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this might seem sudden, but I can't imagine my life without you. You've shown me what true kindness is, and I've fallen in love with the person you are. Will you marry me?" Clara stared at him in shock, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't find the words. Harris, the man she had grown so close to, was proposing to her. She looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. But then reality set in. She wasn't someone who could just say yes to a proposal like this. She wasn't like Mercy, who could accept grand gestures and promises of a life filled with luxury. "Harris," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. I don't know if I can. I'm just me. I don't have anything to offer you. I'm not important. I'm not." Her voice trailed off as tears welled up in her eyes. But Harris wouldn't let her finish. "You're everything, Clara. You don't need to be anyone else. I'm not asking you for anything but your heart." He took her hands in his and looked at her with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. "I want to spend my life with someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I have." Clara's tears fell as she nodded, unable to speak. She had never imagined that someone like Harris could love her, that she could be worthy of such devotion. And yet, here he was, asking her to be his. She finally found her voice, soft and trembling. "Yes, Harris. I will marry you." It was the happiest moment of Harris's life, but it was also fraught with danger. He knew that Rebecca would not allow this to happen without a fight. She had spent years ensuring that Mercy would inherit everything, and now, with Clara poised to marry, Rebecca's plans were in jeopardy. There was no doubt in Harris's mind that Rebecca would retaliate, that she would try to destroy their happiness before it had a chance to flourish. But for now, none of that mattered. Harris and Clara were engaged, bound by a love that had nothing to do with wealth or status. It was real, and that was all that mattered. They had both found what they were looking for, someone who saw them for who they truly were. Still, Harris knew the battle was far from over. He would have to be prepared for what was coming, for the storm that Rebecca was sure to unleash. But as long as Clara was by his side, he was ready to face it all. As the days passed, Harris began to sense the tension building around him. It wasn't just in the cold, calculated looks that Rebecca shot his way or the sharp words she reserved for Clara. It was in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm that was about to break. He knew it couldn't last much longer. Rebecca wasn't one to sit idly by while something disrupted her carefully laid plans, and now that she had begun to notice the bond between him and Clara, it was only a matter of time before she made her move. Rebecca had always been a master at subtle manipulation, but lately, her efforts had become more overt. Harris could see the way she was maneuvering to isolate Clara further, creating situations where she was constantly reminded of her place in the household, or rather, her lack of one. Mercy, of course, played her part perfectly. She seemed to sense the shift in her mother's strategy, taking every opportunity to subtly undermine Clara. A snide comment here, a dismissive gesture there, all designed to remind Clara that she didn't belong. Harris had no doubt that Rebecca was preparing to remove Clara from the equation entirely. Clara had always been a threat, not because of anything she had done, but simply because of who she was, a potential obstacle to Mercy's future inheritance. And with Harris now in the picture, Rebecca saw an even greater danger. The last thing she wanted was for Clara to marry and solidify any claim to the family's wealth. It didn't take long for Rebecca to put her plan into action. The first sign came when Harris overheard a conversation between Rebecca and one of the family's lawyers. It was clear from their hushed tones that something was in the works, something meant to ensure that Clara would be left with nothing. Harris listened carefully, his heart pounding as he pieced together the details. Rebecca was preparing to disinherit Clara completely. There would be no room for her in the will, no claim to any of the estate. Everything was to go to Mercy, and Clara would be cast out, forgotten as though she had never existed. Harris knew he couldn't let this happen. But he also knew that if he acted too soon, if he revealed his true identity before the right moment, Rebecca would find a way to twist things to her advantage. He had to be patient, to wait until Rebecca made her final move. Only then could he step in and change the course of events. In the meantime, he watched as Rebecca tightened her grip on the household. She became more aggressive in her treatment of Clara, though always in ways that could be explained away. Clara's tasks grew more burdensome, her place in the family even more tenuous. Harris could see the toll it was taking on her, but Clara never complained. She bore it all with the same quiet strength she had always shown, though Harris could see the cracks beginning to form. Mercy, of course, thrived in this environment. She had never been one to shy away from cruelty, especially when it served her own interests. She relished the power her mother's schemes gave her, using it to assert her dominance over Clara whenever possible. Harris found it increasingly difficult to hide his disdain for her. The more time he spent around Mercy, the more he saw her for what she truly was, spoiled, entitled, and utterly lacking in empathy. One evening, after a particularly harsh exchange between Clara and Rebecca, Harris found Clara sitting alone in the garden, her face drawn and weary. He sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. Clara had always been strong, but he could see the weight of her isolation bearing down on her. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut him to the core. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've tried to be patient, to be kind, but no matter what I do, it's never enough. I don't belong here, Harris. I never have." Harris's heart ached at her words. He wanted to tell her the truth right then, to tell her that soon, none of this would matter, that he would make sure she was never treated like this again. But he knew he had to wait. He couldn't reveal everything just yet. Instead, he took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You do belong here, Clara," he said softly. "You belong wherever you choose to be. Don't let them make you feel like you're worth less than anyone else. You're stronger than you know." Clara smiled weakly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not sure how much strength I have left." Harris didn't respond, but in that moment, he made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would protect Clara from the storm that was coming. He would make sure that Rebecca's plans didn't succeed, that Clara wouldn't be cast aside like some disposable part of their lives. As the days went by, Harris kept his eyes and ears open, waiting for the moment when Rebecca would make her final move. And it wasn't long before it came. One afternoon, while working in the garden, he overheard Rebecca speaking with Mercy. It was the confirmation he had been waiting for. Rebecca was planning to confront Clara and force her out of the house for good. The pretense was simple. Clara was no longer welcome in a household that belonged to Mercy. Rebecca would frame it as a necessary step, ensuring that everything was in place for Mercy's future. Harris's blood boiled as he listened to their plan. He had to act fast, but he couldn't reveal everything just yet. He needed to confront Rebecca when she was most vulnerable, when her plan was about to be executed, so there would be no escape. That evening, Harris made his preparations. The time had come to expose the truth, to reveal who he really was and to stop Rebecca from destroying Clara's life. He had waited long enough. Now, it was time to take control of the situation. As he watched the sun set over the horizon, Harris knew that the next day would change everything. And he was ready. The day had arrived. Rebecca, unaware of the storm about to hit her carefully constructed world, was preparing to confront Clara and finalize her plan. She had made sure every detail was in place, confident that soon Clara would be out of her life for good. Mercy, her ever-willing accomplice, stood by, eager to witness the removal of the only obstacle to her complete inheritance. As far as they were concerned, everything was falling perfectly into place. But what they didn't know was that Harris had been one step ahead all along. He had carefully observed, waited for the right moment, and now it was time to reveal his true hand. Everything Rebecca had plotted so meticulously was about to unravel in front of her eyes, and she had no idea it was coming. Rebecca's plan was simple in its cruelty. She would approach Clara under the guise of necessity, telling her that her presence in the house was no longer required and that she needed to leave immediately. There would be no dramatic outbursts, just a quiet, calculated push out the door, designed to make Clara feel like she had no choice but to comply. It was a tactic Rebecca had perfected over the years, using subtlety and manipulation to achieve her goals without ever having to get her hands dirty. But as Rebecca moved to enact her plan, Harris was already in motion. He had anticipated this move, knowing that Rebecca wouldn't be able to resist striking when she thought the moment was perfect. He had gathered everything he needed, the proof, the documents, the full truth of who he really was. Now, all he needed to do was step into the light and let the truth speak for itself. The confrontation between Rebecca and Clara began just as Harris had expected. Rebecca, her voice dripping with false sympathy, approached Clara with the pretense of doing what was best for the family. She spoke of how things had changed, how the household could no longer support an extra person, and how Clara's departure was simply a matter of practicality. Mercy stood nearby, barely concealing her smirk, ready to celebrate her victory. Clara, though visibly shaken, listened in silence. She had known for some time that this moment was coming, though it didn't make it any less painful. Rebecca's words stung not just because of their content, but because they reinforced what Clara had always feared, that no matter how hard she tried, she would never truly belong in this family. She would always be an outsider, someone who could be discarded when she was no longer useful. But before Rebecca could finish, Harris stepped forward. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Rebecca looked at him, surprised and annoyed by his sudden intrusion. She had no idea what was about to unfold. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Rebecca," he began, his voice calm but firm. "There's something you need to know before you continue." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her frustration evident. "This doesn't concern you, Harris. It's a family matter." Harris's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "That's where you're wrong. It concerns me more than you realize." Without another word, Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out a series of documents, holding them up for Rebecca to see. Confusion flashed across her face, quickly replaced by suspicion. Mercy, sensing the shift, took a step forward, her brow furrowing. "These," Harris continued, "are documents that prove exactly who I am. I've kept this hidden for a reason, but now it's time for the truth." Rebecca's confidence wavered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharper now, betraying her growing unease. "I'm not just a gardener," Harris said, his tone steady. "I'm Harris Desmond, heir to the Desmond family fortune. I came here in disguise to find out what kind of people I was dealing with. I wanted to see if anyone would treat me with kindness, not because of my wealth, but because of who I am." The room fell into stunned silence. Rebecca's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Mercy looked as though she had been struck, her expression one of disbelief and growing horror. Harris didn't give them time to recover. "Clara," he said, turning to her with a warmth in his eyes, is the only person in this household who treated me like a human being. She didn't know who I was, and it didn't matter. She showed me kindness when everyone else showed me contempt. Clara, still reeling from the revelation, stared at Harris in shock. She hadn't known the extent of his deception, but as the truth began to sink in, she realized why he had done it. He had come here to find something real, and in her, he had found exactly that. Harris turned back to Rebecca and Mercy, his gaze hardening. And now I see you for who you really are. Rebecca, your entire life has been about manipulating those around you to secure wealth and power. Mercy, you've been raised to believe that the world owes you something, that everything will be handed to you without question. Rebecca finally found her voice, though it was shaky. You don't understand. Everything I've done has been for my family, for my daughter's future. You have no right. I have every right. Harris interrupted, his voice rising slightly. You tried to tear Clara down, to make her feel like she was nothing. But she's everything. And now, everything you've built, all your schemes, mean nothing. I'm taking Clara with me, and we'll be leaving this house behind. Mercy, desperate to salvage the situation, stepped forward. Harris, wait. You don't have to leave. We can. But Harris didn't let her finish. Mercy, you're a product of this environment, and I pity you for that. But I won't be part of it anymore. I won't stand by while people like you and your mother destroy lives. Rebecca, her face pale, seemed to deflate. Her power, her control over everything, was slipping through her fingers, and she could do nothing to stop it. Harris extended his hand to Clara, who took it without hesitation. Together, they turned and walked away, leaving Rebecca and Mercy to face the wreckage of their own making. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. As Harris and Clara left the mansion behind, the weight of everything that had transpired finally began to settle. Clara still couldn't fully comprehend the revelation of who Harris truly was. It wasn't the wealth that stunned her, but the fact that someone like him had chosen her, of all people, to love. The quiet humility that had always defined Clara made it difficult for her to accept that she could be deserving of such devotion. But in Harris she saw a man who had not only recognized her worth but had fought to protect it when no one else would. Harris, for his part, felt an immense sense of relief. The truth was out, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly free. He had come into that household under a false pretense, hoping to find someone who would care for him without the shadow of his fortune hanging over them. And now, he had found Clara, someone who had never cared about money, power, or status. She had only ever seen him as a person, not as a bank balance or a title. That was the love he had been searching for all along. But even as they walked away from the mansion, Harris knew that the consequences of what had just happened would echo long after they were gone. Rebecca and Mercy were left behind to deal with the fallout, their plans shattered, their future uncertain. Harris couldn't help but feel a small satisfaction knowing that the very people who had tried to manipulate him had ended up exposing themselves for what they truly were, greedy, shallow, and utterly lacking in integrity. Rebecca, for all her wealth and cunning, had lost the one thing she valued most, control. And without it, her carefully constructed world began to crumble. There was no amount of scheming or manipulation that could undo the damage that had been done. Harris had exposed her, and now she would have to face the consequences of a life built on lies and greed. As for Mercy, Harris knew that her path would be a difficult one. She had spent her life believing that she was entitled to everything without having to earn it. Now, faced with the reality that she had lost it all, Mercy would have to come to terms with the emptiness of her actions. Harris hoped, though he doubted it, that this experience would force her to reflect on the choices she had made. But deep down, he suspected that Mercy would cling to her bitterness, blaming everyone but herself for the position she now found herself in. For Clara, though, this was the beginning of something new. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of Rebecca's cruelty, always feeling like she was never enough. But now, for the first time, she could see a future where she wasn't defined by her past or by the people who had tried to diminish her. She had been given a chance to start fresh, and Harris had given her the strength to believe in herself. Their new life together wouldn't be defined by wealth or status. Harris had already made that clear. He didn't want the trappings of his old world to taint what they were building. He had found what truly mattered, someone who loved him for who he was, not what he had. And that was more valuable to him than anything his family's fortune could buy. The world outside the mansion felt different, lighter somehow, as if they had left behind more than just a house. They had left behind the weight of expectations, the suffocating influence of greed and manipulation. Now they could breathe. Now they could live. Harris knew that their journey wouldn't be without challenges. Life, even for someone with his resources, was never easy. But he also knew that with Clara by his side, they could face whatever came their way. Her quiet strength had inspired him from the moment he met her, and it would continue to inspire him for the rest of his life. As they walked, Clara glanced at Harris, her expression still filled with uncertainty. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had endured. Harris smiled gently, squeezing her hand. "Whatever we want," he replied. "We're free to choose our own path now. No one else gets to decide that for us." Clara nodded, though a small part of her still struggled to believe it. She had spent so long living under the thumb of others that the idea of freedom felt almost foreign to her. But with Harris by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally find peace. For Harris, the road ahead was clear. He had spent years searching for something real, something genuine, and now he had found it. It wasn't in the boardrooms or the luxury estates. It wasn't in the deals or the power plays that had defined his life before. It was in Clara's smile, in her quiet courage, in the way she had cared for him without knowing who he really was. That was where his future lay. Together they walked into the unknown, leaving behind the wreckage of a life built on deception and greed. Harris had found his truth, and in doing so, he had given Clara the freedom to find hers. As for Rebecca and Mercy, their fate was sealed by their own actions. They had tried to destroy Clara to secure their own futures, but in the end, they had destroyed only themselves. Harris knew that they would likely never understand the depth of their failure. People like them rarely did. But that wasn't his concern anymore. They were part of a life he had left behind, a life that no longer held any value for him. What mattered now was the future he and Clara would build together, a future grounded in love, respect, and honesty. They had both suffered at the hands of those who valued wealth above all else, but now they had the chance to create something different, something pure. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. As they walked further from the mansion, the weight of the past slowly lifted, leaving them with nothing but the promise of a new beginning. The world, vast and unpredictable, lay before them, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a place where anything was possible. Together, they would face whatever came their way, knowing that they had found in each other something far more valuable than money or power. They had found love, the kind that no amount of wealth could ever buy.